One of the real challenges facing any third party or independent movement is the element, the extent to which corporations really control the democratic process. I don't know if you heard recently about the governor of Wisconsin taking a prank phone call from a caller who pretended to be one of the Koch brothers who are funding the Tea Party movement and who have just been pouring money in a fairly unrestricted fashion into the democratic process. Well, it's real difficult for the people to control the democratic process when money is such an overriding factor. It's really no longer one person, one vote. It's really $1, one vote. And the more dollars you have, the more votes you can buy. At the heart of that is the notion that corporations have rights, that corporations have unfettered free speech rights. And our speaker tonight is here to talk about ways that communities and individuals can regain control of our lives and our communities and of the electoral process. David Cobb, as many of you know, was the Green Party's presidential candidate in 2004. During that time, and towards the conclusion of the campaign, David stood up and demanded a recount of presidential votes in Ohio because something was rotten in the state of Ohio. That recount led to investigations by Congress, a couple of different congressional hearings, convictions in the state of Ohio, a statewide recount that was the first and only statewide recount of presidential votes in the history of the United States, and it led to a very rare electoral college vote challenge, something that should have been done in 2000 that wasn't done. And fortunately, in 2004, there was at least one honest senator that stood up and demanded that something be done about that. And that has really ushered in a new era of consciousness about the use of electronic voting machines. In one county in Ohio, there were more votes recorded for George W. Bush than there were registered voters in that county. Something was wrong. And David stood up and demanded a recount. David has gone on to work almost exclusively in the area of corporate accountability with organizations such as the Liberty Tree Foundation, Democracy Unlimited of Humboldt County, and the Move to Amend organization. So you're in for a real treat tonight. Just one of the hardest working activists that there is in this country, a very talented and dedicated individual. And please sit back, listen to what he has to say. Please welcome David Cobb.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Blair. It is such a pleasure to be back in Corvallis. I actually was through here recently, or it feels recent to me, but almost just after that Citizens United case. And I came through on a barnstorming tour, and I'll tell you straight up, y'all, I have been basically on the move ever since, going and speaking to people about what's going on in this country. And I like to always start off by saying, it's true, my name is David Cobb. I am a proud, I am a patriotic, and these days I am a pissed off American citizen. Yeah? I just want to check and make sure I'm in the right place. You know, and I'm very serious about that. I am angry, but it is a righteous anger. You know, it's the same kind of anger that led the American revolutionaries who were angry about the British Empire. It's the same kind of anger that fueled the abolitionist movement, that was angry at the pathology of the institution of slavery. It's the same kind of anger that led Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and the women's movement of Seneca Falls, what I think of as first wave feminism, or the women's suffrage movement. It's the same kind of anger that led the trade union movement in this country. It's the same kind of anger that led the civil rights movement. You know, there is a point at which anger that comes from a righteous place, an anger at injustice, an anger at destruction, an anger at oppression. And I, for one, am tired of having the Tea Party act as if they have a monopoly on righteous anger. Right? I'm angry too. And you know, here's something, y'all. There are points at which I share a righteous anger with Tea Party adherents. I too am angry at the fact that Wall Street America and the big bankers destroyed the economy of this country. I'm mad about that. And I'm also mad that George W. Bush sent hundreds of millions of dollars to Wall Street and Main Street. And like the Tea Party, I'm angry at that President Barack Obama sent additional hundreds of millions of dollars to Wall Street and the bankers. And did you know that in the final accounting, it's going to be over $1 trillion of our public tax dollars that goes to Wall Street and Main Street over the next 5 to 10 years. If you do the math, what you see is probably the largest transfer of private wealth or public wealth in the history of this country into a very few private hands. You damn right I'm angry about that. And you know, what really gets me is when I think back, I can remember when I could say I was a proud and patriotic American with no qualifier. Can any of y'all remember that moment? For me, so I see a lot of heads saying, no, not really. I invite you then to think back to your childhood. For real. Because that's the last time that I can remember being unabashedly proud to be an American without a single qualifier. And you know why? Because I had been taught that I was from the land of the free and the home of the brave. I had been taught that I was from a country of liberty and justice and equality. And damn it all, I was proud to be from that country. And you know, I didn't really understand all the implications of that, but I did know this, that it meant that I was from a country, I was from a nation of fairness. That I came from a place where we were the great shining light on the hill to the rest of the world. And not only were we a country of liberty, justice, and equality, but I had been told that we would bring liberty and justice and equality to the rest of the world. And you know, I was so eager to be part of that. And what I've realized as I've grown up is that I was lied to. But I do want to be clear about something. I don't believe that Mrs. Armstrong, who was my 5th grade teacher, I don't think that she intentionally lied to me. I mean, I can remember her. I can still remember her face. I have an honest-to-goodness memory of Mrs. Armstrong. And that lady did not stay up at night going, wah-ah-ah-ah. I can't wait till those kids come into class so I can fill their head full of lies and propaganda. No! No, Mrs. Armstrong was a public school teacher. She taught elementary school because she wanted to create citizens. She wanted to help children learn and to think. And I say, and I mean this sincerely, any public teachers in the crowd, if you'd raise your hand for a moment? Thank you. No, hey, no lie. Public school teachers and anybody who ever ran for public office. When I meet any of those two categories, I always say thank you. So Mrs. Armstrong, as a public school teacher, was not involved in an intentional deception. See, I think she believed what she was teaching. And even further, I believed it, and all the children believed it, and virtually anybody who goes through a public education process, what some now would call a subtle propaganda process, we believe that because we want to believe it. I mean, the creation myth of this country is not all lies. There's actually a lot of truth to it. But even beyond that, it speaks to us. The creation myth works because we want it to be true. And let me tell you this. It's not that we want it because we are Americans. We want it because we're human beings. Because school children in Kenya and in Iraq and in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya, all across the world, people want to live in a country of liberty and justice and equality and democracy. These are human ideals. And one of the challenges that I will make to you and that I make everywhere that I go is to begin to think beyond the nation state and begin to think at a global level that we are all connected. And when we start to think that way, for me, when I start to think that way and I really get into it, I get a sense of power. I get a real sense of understanding that when the Egyptians are marching in the street, that's my people. When the Libyans are challenging a despotic regime, those are my people. And may I say, Madison, Wisconsin, 100,000 of our people are in the streets right now. Right? We're on the move. Now, what's interesting to me is, as I look back at that creation myth that we've been taught, I want to just say it right up front. I declare this room, this space, this evening, a truth-telling zone, right? I'm going to tell the truth as I see it to the very best of my ability. And we can engage in a conversation. We'll find out how much we agree or disagree. But what I think we need to do is really diagnose what the problem is and then begin to act as collectively as we possibly can. Where we might have efforts or points of departure, that's okay. That's okay, but we really need to at least tell the truth about what's going on. So I'll tell this truth right up front. The United States of America is not now, nor has it ever been, nor was it ever designed to be an actual functioning democracy. Now, I got to say, you know what? It's a self-selecting crowd tonight, because what I saw was, I have the privilege of being up front looking at all you, and I didn't see any wide eyes or anything. I got to tell you, a couple of years ago when I would say that, I would get a lot of reaction. But people don't really react that way anymore. I think it may be because the truth is becoming ever more apparent. But I say we're not a democracy. Can anybody break this? First of all, what language does this word come from? Greek. Somebody break it down. Demos. The people. Again, this is a self-selecting crowd. Kratia. Rule. That's right. So democracy, if we actually just take that word at its face, democracy means the people rule. Does anybody believe that we, the people, are collectively actually ruling in this country? Right? I mean, look at poll after poll after poll. The overwhelming majority of Americans want an end to the illegal, immoral, and unconstitutional war in Iraq and, I would add, Afghanistan. And bombs continue to fall. And I will say, with respect, regardless of whether a Democrat or a Republican is in the White House, bombs continue to fall. The overwhelming majority of Americans, poll after poll shows, not just that they want health insurance, they want access to health care as a fundamental human right. You know, the way that the rest of the entire Western industrial world does it. And today, continuously, we have health care treated as a commodity, which will be bought and paid for at a profit. The overwhelming majority of Americans want to see us transition away from fossil fuels, which is clearly driving a global climate crisis. And yet, we continue to use oil and ever more coal in order to fuel the energy policy of this country. And I'll tell you this. Corporations, Blair mentioned them. Another truth, corporations are not merely exercising power today. Corporations are ruling us. Corporations, unelected and unaccountable corporate CEOs, have literally hijacked this country, and they are making the public policy decisions that affect our lives. And they are shrouding those public decisions and pretending as if they're private decisions. Like how many people here are eating genetically mutated organisms on a daily basis?
Every one of
them. Yeah, there you go. See, all the hands went up, and the sister even said, every one of us. You know, you're spoiling my punchline, sister, but that's okay, because it was spoiled for everybody, because everybody raised their hands. We're all eating it, right? We can't help it. Why? Because it's in our public food supply. I mean, even if you actually grow all of your own food, if you eat any processed food at all, you are assuredly eating some amount of GMO in your diet. So let me ask you this. Who made that very public decision to put GMOs in our public food supply? Monsanto Corporation, Archer Daniels Midland Corporation.
They fund research at OSU.
And they fund research at OSU.
People that I like wanting it.
There you go. But here's the point. Now, put aside a moment the debate, and I think there should be a debate about the health effects, the environmental effects. I mean, what the effects are of genetically mutated organisms. You know, I'm not going to get into that scientific debate, but I will tell you this. It is clearly a public policy decision. But that public policy decision was made behind closed doors. We, the people, were not allowed to participate in that decision. Hell, we didn't even know the decision was being made until after the fact. And now, in this country, the biggest fight, most even of the engaged citizens that I know are clamoring, label it. You know what the rest of the world, what activists are yelling? Ban it. Can you see the difference? Right? I mean, I just want to point out that whenever we start thinking about public versus private, this is a public policy decision, and yet our legal system, our economic system, our political system pretends as if it's a private decision. And we could go through the same process really about transportation choices, healthcare choices. There's really not a single important choice. Educational choices, media, except for people's media, right? Because I know right now, by the way, if you're watching this, it's because you're watching people's media that is not subject to the corporate filter. However, what we all know, what you know who's watching this right now, is that what passes for news in the United States of America is propaganda. They're lies. We are being lied to on a consistent and daily basis. And for me, one of the things that actually is quite exciting is that more and more people are aware of that. Right? But here's the point. How did it come to be? How did it come to be that corporations have so much power? Well, just as I asked the question about the word democracy, I'm going to now ask about corporation. Does anybody know what language that comes from? Latin. And so just as we broke democracy down, corpus means the body, or to have, and having T-I-O-N for you Latin scholars means the state of having. So the word corporation means the state of having a body. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important. It's Latin because the first corporations ever in the history of human beings came out of the Roman Republic. Not, by the way, the Roman Empire. And I tell you, I wish we had enough time to really delve into what happens when a nation devolves from being a republic to an empire, because that might be an important conversation today. Flag that. Maybe we'll do it during the discussion point. But the reason that the word corporation comes from Latin is because the first corporations were actually created during the Roman Republic. And they were entities that were used to create, for example, the road system. A road system, by the way, that was so elaborate that there was a famous saying, all roads lead to Rome. That entire network was actually built by and maintained by corporations. Likewise, the first universities actually were created by and operated as corporations. The Colosseum, you know, that famous bit of architecture, which is so impressive that it still stands to this day, was actually created by a corporation. The first hospitals, corporations. Can anybody see what any of these things have in common? A hospital, a road system, an aqueduct system. Say it again? An infrastructure, but what kind? Somebody? Public works, public purpose. The point is, folks, gosh, it's almost like I had that planned out. They're all public entities. And here is, and I will say this, the genius of the idea of the corporation. Because David Cobb is not actually anti-corporation. I'm pro-democracy, but I'm not anti-corporation because a corporation, as we're taught in law school, do you remember? A legal fiction. Any other lawyers in the crowd or anybody who would admit it? Come on, Blair, it's a friendly crowd. Do you remember, Blair? A corporation is a legal fiction. And we're taught that in law school because we're told a corporation doesn't really exist in the material world. You know, reality. It doesn't really exist, but we'll pretend like it exists so we can organize people and things and get things done and then treat it under law as if it did exist. And watch this. Presto changeo. If enough people agree, you know what happens? It really exists. Folks, this is something very powerful, and I don't want to get too metaphysical on us here, but I'll challenge you to this. When enough people think that something is true and then act as if it's true, you know what happens? So I'm going to just do this. The United States is experiencing a democracy movement that will win. Just going to put that out there. Put that out there. I'm going to invite you to put that out there with me. Because when enough of us believe it and act on it, you know what happens? Ta-da! Egypt. But here's the thing. The first corporations were created, but they were to put a public use, but it was private money. And catch this. This is not the first time in human history that private money has been used to do public things. But the difference is this. I have an idea as the administrator that I'd like to build this road system. Would you be willing to either give or invest money in this project? Yes or no?
Yes.
Would you be willing, thank you, would you be willing to invest or just make a contribution? Say no, ma'am. Would you be willing to invest or give a donation to my project?
No.
Very well. Sir, would you? No. Now, you see, it is a request. You entice people to either invest in or even make a gift towards this public project. Up until that time, the only way that private monies had been used for public purposes was taxes. Now, I don't ask for a tax as the state, do I? No. So you said yes, you said yes. What happens if the Roman centurions show up to ask for her tax to be paid? And she says, what? She says, what? She says, yes. You see the difference? The genius, and I really mean this, the genius of the idea of creating a corporation is to create private money to do a public thing, but it's voluntary. It's voluntary. This is really a genius idea. But of course, the modern transnational corporations don't exactly operate that way, do they? No, and in fact, if we're going to actually tell the story of the corporation today, or what I will call the transnational corporation, we have to actually go back to the 13th and 14th, 15th century of Europe. You know, the age of discovery? I have to put that in quotation marks, right? Because that's not the age of discovery, is it? Because we said this was a truth-telling zone. So although I was taught in school to think of it as the age of discovery, it's not the age of discovery. It's the age of rape and pillage and plunder. It is the age of murder and theft. That's what colonialism really is all about. In fact, the age of discovery, what were they discovering, by the way? Africa, Asia, North and South America? Newsflash, there were people living there. They didn't need to be discovered, right? The reality is that those lands were being subjected to a brutal pillaging so that the public wealth of those lands could be stolen and carried to the coffers of Europe, the monarchs, the sovereigns, if you will. By the way, that's another thing that's a word that I think is incredibly important. The sovereigns of their day. And who, by the way, was the sovereigns of 13th, 14th, and 15th century Europe? Say it again. That's true. The popes, but who are the political sovereigns? The kings. And, watch this. And where did the king get their authority? God. Right?
Or so they claim.
Or so they claim. Let me tell you something, folks. You don't get more legitimate. Right? I mean, if you can assert that you are God's spokesperson and the rest of everybody else believes it, that is power. That's sovereignty. Because the word sovereign actually doesn't mean king. You know what the word actually means? Who rules? So the question of sovereignty, or who rules, who is the legitimate ruler at the time. And so catch this. The first corporations that we would think of today, the transnational corporations, were created by the sovereign, by the king, with something called a royal crown charter. And the word charter is important. The charter created this new entity. And these new business entities were actually taking private money in order, and then cloaked it with the public persona, only this time, instead of actual public projects, they were used to build vast armadas, raise huge armies and navies, and go out and plunder the rest of the world. You know, like the Dutch East Indies Corporation, which was created literally in order to subjugate peoples all along the Indonesian archipelago. And in fact, then to legitimize and legalize that corporate colonial conquest. Likewise, the Africa Trading Company was created this time. Does anybody want to hazard a guess what the Africa Trading Company traded? People. Thank you so much for saying people. You know, because oftentimes people say, or folks, when I ask that question, they say slaves, which is an abstraction, right? They traded people. And may I say, humbly and carefully, people virtually just like me and you. And I say that very specifically with a clear understanding that my pigment does not look like I come from Africa. Although, and I love to say this, I wish sometime I could tell David Duke to remind him that we're all Africans actually, that actually we all actually come out of Africa. But I say it with a very clear understanding of my own pigment. The reason I say this is because, and hold on to your hats here, ask any scientist and they will tell you race does not exist. And I'll say, surely pigment exists, of course. Hair color, or those of you who have hair, hair color exists, eye color exists, facial features exist, even ethnicity exists, but race doesn't exist. These little distinctions would never, for a scientist or a biologist, rise to a taxonomy. But because enough of us believe that it exists, we act like it exists, you know what happens? Presto changeo, it exists. We have literally created something that doesn't exist in scientific reality. And that's why I like to say race doesn't exist, but racism does. That's something that for a lot of white folks, and I got to admit it took me a long time to really internalize that and really begin to understand that. The reason, though, that I really make such a big deal about this is to understand that the idea of race was created for the first time during the 13th, 14th, and 15th century Europe. Why? Was it because slavery had never existed before? Of course not. Slavery had existed before, but it went like this. Let's say that Blair and I are on opposite sides of the river, and we pretty much look alike. Blair's got a little more hair, but I'm a little taller. But on the whole, we basically, we're brothers. We could pass for each other. Yet, if we went to war and my side won, and my side wins because I'm the one talking, but my side wins, I put a spear up against Blair's neck and I say, you are my slave. Let me ask you something. What is my philosophical justification for enslaving Blair? The sword. Power. Nothing more. It is blatant, it is naked, it is clear. But check this out. The idea of race gets created for the first time in human history in order to justify the idea of enslaving an entire group of human beings for no other reason than pigment. That's a very powerful and profound way to think about it. And the reason that I want to do it is to point out how interrelated, inextricably linked historically the creation of the modern transnational corporation is to both militarism and racism. And you know, I'm not the first one who observed that, because many of you will remember that the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was very famous for his I Have a Dream speech. But you know, the speech that I think that's a hell of a lot more profound, a hell of a lot more important, was one delivered at the Riverside Church in Harlem months before he got shot. Right? And that's whenever he pointed out the triple evils, he called it, of militarism, materialism, or what we might call capitalism, and racism. that those triple evils, whenever he began to challenge the Vietnam War in a very profound way and was making the links between poor people and sanitation workers on strike in Memphis, Tennessee, and the anti-war movement. And let me tell you something, it's worth pointing out that the great Reverend could have a dream and amass 100,000 people on the Washington Mall, but when you start actually making the links between racism, the empire, and materialism, you get shot. So, my strategy, however, is to hide right out in the open and to be as loud as I can possibly be and try to get as many people actually saying the same thing at the same time. And I think actually, as I look back on U.S. history and world history, that's the only way that we, the people, have ever actually won significant movements in this country. So the point is that the corporation is actually created for the first time in history as an instrument of colonial conquest, right? That's actually what it was designed to do. So I'm actually not surprised when these huge corporations destroy the planet, commodify life as we know it, amass great wealth, and try to externalize any of the costs. That's what they're designed to do. It's not to say that the people who work in them are bad people. It's just what they're designed to do. Now, let's fast forward the conversation to the founding of this country. Here's a gimme. How many original colonies here in the United States? 13. That's right. And they were colonies, by the way, right? It's worth remembering that. But of those 13 colonies, does anybody know how many of those were actually corporations? Almost every one. At one level, actually, if you think about it, they were all corporations because they were all giving body to a new entity. But actually, 11 of them, Maryland and Pennsylvania, were actually land grants. But actually 11 of them were literally corporations, were for-profit corporations. And the charter that created them went like this. I, the king, will create this new geographic boundary called the Virginia Company. Not the Commonwealth of Virginia, but the Virginia Company. I will create this other geographic entity called the Massachusetts Bay Trading Colony, specifically the Trading Colony. I will create Georgia, by the way, as, does anybody know? A penal corporation. But like Australia was a penal corporation as well. Now the point is that all of these corporations were created by the king, these geographic areas, and in the charter that created them, it read like this: I, the king, will now grant to this new governor who I will appoint the authority to govern in my name and to plant and rule and govern. Literally, when you think about it, this model that was being created at the time was a model where politically they were transnational corporations to begin with, right? And so the appointed governors were really the functional equivalent of a CEO. That's what they were responsible to do. And then the people who were brought as indentured servants and then later actually as the enslaved Africans, their whole purpose was to make a profit for the shareholders. And do you know, by the way, does anybody want to hazard a guess at the outbreak of the American Revolution, what percentage of the English Parliament owned shares in the East India Corporation? I'll give you a hint. It's actually 3 digits. 100%. Every single member of Parliament owned shares in the East India Corporation. In fact, there was a time just before the American Revolution that the fellow who rang the bell and 11 o'clock and all is well, there were some when the American Revolution was just about to just about to explode. And do you know what some of those town criers were yelling? Beware the East India Corporation. I mean, it was, in fact, the American Revolution was not only a rejection of monarchy, which is a powerful thing, right? It was also an uprising against corporate rule. Think about it. And by the way, when our children today play out and reenact the Boston Tea Party, I mean, do kids still do that? I don't know if you've got children or our nieces or nephews or grandchildren. Does that still happen, Blair? You bet. It's too bad because I remember that was my breakout performance. I was Indian number 3 at Bay Cliff Elementary. But what were we playing out? We were playing out the most incredible, the most empowering, and the most expensive act of nonviolent civil disobedience that has ever taken place on the American continent. What is the functional equivalent of millions of dollars of corporate property was damaged. So, as somebody who was on the streets of Seattle in November of 1999, some of you may remember the World Trade Organization protests. Yeah, you were there, sister? Yeah, a couple of others were there. Me and about, 79,000 of our closest friends actually engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience. And I would suggest to you that is actually the American legacy as well, right? So the point I'm making about all of this is to really understand that the American Revolution, and as the kids say today, from the jump, the American experience was something that understood the transnational corporation. And so we kick the king out, right? The king is no longer sovereign, and so we create a new legal document. Now, I wish we had time to talk about the Articles of Confederation, which were actually based upon the Great Iroquois Confederation, because that was actually, I think, a much more functioning democratic system in place, where you devolve power to the local level into the state, and the nation state was actually very, very weak. And we're taught in high school, if you're even taught about the Articles anymore, but when I was in school, we were taught, oh, it's very ineffective, it was very dysfunctional. Actually, it was very functional, but it was too democratic. And the ruling elite didn't like it. So actually, the U.S. Constitution was actually created. By the way, that Constitutional Convention, do you realize that the folks dispatched to Philadelphia back in 1787 were not sent to actually write a whole new Constitution? They were actually sent to make a few proposals to make the Articles of Confederation work together better. They got together and actually wrote an entire new Constitution. So, but I'll flag that. The U.S. Constitution, we are taught in law school, is the supreme law of the land. It is, in fact, the charter of the United States of America. And how many people here have read the Constitution in the last year, let's say? Wow. All right. I like that. All right, so y'all grade my papers and see if I get this right. Because I will suggest to you that the U.S. Constitution really has two prominent actors, or two major components. The first major component is the most important component. It's the first 3 words of that document. You know, those are hallowed words in this country. And the very fact that I can just say the first 3 words of that document, put my hand up to my ear and have you all repeat it, says something. We the people. The second actor, the second idea, is that we the people create government. Under this document, we the people are free and sovereign. And what does sovereign mean again? Rule. We rule. Government is subordinate and accountable. Government is subordinate to whom? The people. Government is accountable to whom? I kind of like how that... You're getting ahead of us. I kind of like how that goes, though. We the people are free and sovereign. Government is subordinate and accountable. It has a ring to it. We the people are described in this document as having individual rights. Government is described as having collective duties. And in fact, in law, the interchange between rights and duties is the very foundation of law. In other words, if I have a right to do something, I can do it and I don't need your permission. I don't need your individual permission. I don't need your collective permission. I don't need the city of Corvallis' governmental agency's permission. I don't need the state of Oregon's permission. I don't need the federal government's permission. Do you get what I'm saying? If you got a right to do something, you can damn well do it. Likewise, if I have a duty, it means I have to do it. even if I don't want to. And if I owe Brother Blair a duty under law and I try to refuse to do it, then he can get either the civil society through the court system or ultimately even the police involved to force me to do it. The interchange between rights and duties is profound. And under this document, by the way, we say all legitimate power resides with the people. Hell, it sounds like a Black Panther Party slogan, you know? But that, all power to the people. But you know what's interesting? That is actually how this document is supposed to work. All political power resides with the people, but we delegate a certain amount of power to government. How much power do we delegate to government? What? Only enough to do the duties that we have collectively told the government to do. I mean, when you look at it this way, I think to myself, this is brilliant. Straight up, y'all, this is brilliant. I love this. We should try that in this country. I think it would work. And I am not even joking. This is brilliant because it satisfies my civil libertarian impulses. My idea of, in the private realm, I've got certain rights that I don't need government permission for. I don't need anybody's permission for. So as a civil libertarian, I love that. But too many times our capital L libertarian sisters and brothers focus there and only there. And they forget that there is a public component, that there is a level at which there's not just private civil liberties involved, but there's a communitarian impulse. Do you see the idea of how this government is supposed to operate? And I'm not even kidding, y'all. This is a brilliant way for how actually a democratic republic would operate. It is fantastic. And we've never actually had that in this country. Before I go one step further, waxing poetic about how brilliant the U.S. Constitution is, time out. The Constitution is drafted in 1787 and ratified in, anybody know the year? 1789, nicely done. So let's take the year that it actually becomes the law of the land. In 1789, who gets to actually be legally a person? All right, let's break that down. Because somebody over here said it. All right, so you had to be white. You had to be male. You had to be rich. And, by the way, something that people don't normally talk about, but is very true, you had to be in the right religion. I mean, literally, to enter into contracts in most states in this country, you had to be a member of the right religion. Which, Protestant, except for Maryland, we had to be Catholic. Sorry, pagans. So let's just be clear about something. That is the creation myth of this country. But the founding of this country, for all these beautiful words, and I really want to underscore, they are beautiful words. The reason the creation myth works in this country is because we want it to work. And here's the tricky part. It's kind of sort of true. But it's only kind of sort of true for white people. It's only kind of sort of true for men. And it's only absolutely true for rich white men who were in the right religion. And so it's a complicated history of the United States, but that's not going to stop us from telling the truth. Because here's the thing. The founding of this country is a founding violence. It's a founding violence against the indigenous people who already lived here and were subject to intentional, deliberate genocide. They were murdered on purpose. It's a founding violence against the Africans who were brought enslaved at the barrel of a gun or the point of a spear and forced to build this country. It's a founding violence against women, because women were not people. Women were property. It's not just that women couldn't vote at this time. They literally were property. They couldn't enter into contracts in their own names. Do you know, for example, that there's case law, women trying to enter into contracts and bind themselves under law? And do you know what the court said? This contract is not only voidable, it's void on its face. The same way a child cannot enter into a contract, the court says, women cannot enter into contracts because they don't have capacity. That's actually what this country was like back then. I can see that some of our female friends are not very happy about that idea. And nor should you be. The point is that legally a person was only rich white men of property. So does anybody want to guess? And by the way, I'm going to only talk about adults here, so not the children. It's not a trick question. What percentage of the adult population living in those 13 colonies were actually legally persons in 1789? What percentage? 10%? 20%? You people are not sufficiently cynical. 5 to 7%. 5 to 7% of the original adults at the founding of this country were actually fully legally persons. So some people might say, all right, Cobb, you got a scathing critique about the transnational corporations of the 13th and 15th century. You've got a scathing critique about the founding of this country, but, you know, women can vote now. We got rid of slavery. It's all good. No, because now, frankly, it's time for us to reintroduce into this framework the idea of the corporation, right? So I told you originally, in the very inception, in the Roman Republic, the corporations were created by private dollars to do public good. And then in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century, they became instruments of colonial conquest, right? So now let's ask today, what does it take to form a corporation in the state of Oregon?
3 people. $40.
3 people and how much?
40 or 80.
40 or 80 bucks.
One person, and just fill out a form and pay your 50. Now it's $100.
It's $100. Oh, in Oregon, do they actually let the same person have all 3 roles?
So I know.
Okay, so some states are different. Some states, they actually require different individuals, but you just have to have 3, a president, a secretary, and a treasurer.
Actually, they didn't even ask me for that.
Wow. The point is that in order to form a corporation today, you pay a couple of bucks, you file a piece of paper, and you send it to the Secretary of State. And what will the Secretary of State do? Stamp it and issue you a charter. And it really is a rubber stamp, because a group of my colleagues actually in Virginia, as a political prank, filed articles of incorporation in Virginia in order to create the Killing Corporation, which they intended to manufacture a product that they knew would actually kill people if used according to the prescribed method of using their product. And you know what they dotted their I's and crossed their T's, and you know what happened? They got it. Yes, sir.
Actually, you're right. There have to be 3 officers, but they can all be you.
Okay, so there you go. You have to have 3. I thought so. You had to have 3 officers. But the point is, today, all it takes is filing a piece of paper. And the courts will say, that what are you allowed to do with that corporation, by the way? Anything. And under law, it says anything that is lawful to be done. But for those of us who are paying attention, we might argue, apparently you can do a whole bunch of illegal shit, too, and get away with it. All right? And how long can your corporation last? Forever.
No, you have to pay up every year.
Oh, you have to pay up. That's right. Our cynical friend is to remind us, yeah, you can live forever as long as you pay. Now, let's take a step back to 1789. And let me ask you, do you know what it took to form a corporation for the first 75 years of the United States history? Watch this. You had to get a bill introduced in the state legislature, and it had to pass the lower house by a majority. Then that same bill went to the upper house, and it had to get passed by a majority. And then the governor had to sign it. It was the functional equivalent of passing a law, which is no mean feat for any of you who have engaged in citizen lobbying. And as if that's not enough, every step of the way, you had to prove that there was a public need that was not being currently met either by existing governmental agencies or functions or by any private business. So you had to prove that there was a public need, and as you asked for the privilege, not the right, but the privilege of incorporation, you had to swear that all you would do and all you would ever do was meet the very precise public need. And do you know how long your corporate charter would last?
20 years.
10 to 20 years. at which point it automatically dissolves. All right, so here we are. We're going back, and we're realizing that at one time in this country, in order to form a corporation, you had to prove a public need. If you you had to get the entire government to act, both the legislative and the executive branch. It only lasted 10 to 20 years. And get this, if you were ever found to be exceeding your charter or in any way causing harm to the public good, what happened? Say it out loud. Off with your head. The corporate charter revocation, also known as the corporate death penalty. I mean, and folks, this is not just David Cobb's wishful thinking. This is not just the Green Party's position on corporate power, although it is. This is American history. This is actually how it once was in this country. The point I'm making is that there was a time when the corporation was very tightly controlled. Now, I'm not suggesting that this means it was the land of milk and honey. I'm saying the corporation as an instrument was tightly controlled. You know why? I would argue because the ruling elites already had other institutions that they were using. They had slavery. I see you shake. I'll let you interrupt, but I'm going to at least make my case, and then you can. But the point is that the corporation was not used at that level. In fact, corporate charters were revoked very commonly. So all I'm going to suggest is this. If I am right that this is important, and I am, if I'm right that there's a distinction here, then we have to understand the state government actually is the only entity that can create a corporation through a charter. The state legislature does it. The state legislature could hold those corporations accountable. They are supposed to be subordinate to we the people. The duties of what a corporation can and most importantly can't do are supposed to be actually controlled. They are supposed to be public entities. The point is, folks, that properly understood, a corporation should actually be on this side of the line. And so don't you see that when the U.S. Supreme Court, and by the way, who elects the U.S. Supreme Court? Nobody. So when 5 people say, oh no, a corporation should really properly be considered a person with rights, it perverts this entire framework. It makes it functionally impossible for we the people to actually have a democratic republic. Now, the point is that corporate personhood or corporate constitutional rights is not just an interesting legal matter that legal scholars might debate. It is at the foundation by which the ruling elite have hijacked our entire government. And by the way, Tea Party people and Greens can agree on this. Right? You can take away all of the other opinions on any other issue, but at the end of the day, I'm going to leave you with this. The reality is that our government has been hijacked. Our social institutions have been hijacked. Our media institutions, our educational institutions, our healthcare institutions. Every single aspect of what it means to be an American in this country is actually under corporate control. And if we are going to actually have a functioning democracy, then we're going to have to address the legal system. Because the legal system and the courts are being used to legitimize the theft and corruption of our society. Literally, environmental protection laws are overturned on the basis that they're violating corporations' constitutional rights. Worker protection laws are overturned. Safety laws are violated. And most recently, in the Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, the very integrity of our elections. The court said we can't protect our own elections. And now, corporations, and I should say trade unions, can spend as much money as they want on elections. More money was spent in the last election cycle than in the history of the United States.
What did Mussolini call this form of government?
Say it. Fascism. Folks, and let's just be clear, Mussolini actually said fascism more properly should be called corporatism.
That's what he called it first.
He called it first, corporatism. And he was, be clear, Mussolini was proud of it. right? He was a defender of this idea. And he said it's brilliant because we merge the economic might of our mighty large corporations with the national might of the government itself to fuse a powerful fist. He was proud of it. And I think, frankly, we need to get more comfortable with the F word in this country. China's doing it now. And many people looking at this country, David Cobb would say, damn, we just have a kinder, more gentler version of it. Right? So the point I'm making is this, y'all, that we need a movement in this country that is actually going to dismantle the legal system, or at least those aspects of the legal system that have taken away our power to govern ourselves. I'm not saying that democracy means David Cobb wins. I'm saying democracy means the people rule, and that there needs to be a political process by which we engage in political discourse and debate, and we can't allow courts to overturn laws that attempt to control corporate harm. But before I end, I do want to underscore this. There is a role for the courts to overturn laws. That is, anytime a law actually violates somebody's rights. For example, the Patriot Act. That is actually illegitimate, yet the courts, including the Democrats on the U.S. Supreme Court, upheld it. Laws that alleged that women were could not vote, those laws should have been overturned. But do you know what the United States Supreme Court said in Minor versus Happersett? No, women are not persons for the purposes of the 14th Amendment, and they upheld those laws. It took a constitutional amendment to overturn it. Likewise, those laws that said that Africans were not people and were originally slaves, and then the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, Jim Crow segregation laws enact, I argue those laws were illegitimate. The court should have overturned them. They didn't overturn them until there was a mass social movement in the streets. And Brown versus Board of Education, let me ask you something. Do you think that the court went to bed white supremacist one day and woke up like seeing the light? Or do you think that Thurgood Marshall, the brilliant lawyer that he was, do you think that he thought of a legal argument that nobody had thought of before? Or do you think instead that it was 50 years of organizing by the Anti-Lynching League and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and white folks who were actually marching in the streets to force that change? I guess the point is this, folks. We need a social movement in this country that's going to take itself seriously. And I'm proud to tell you that movement is happening. It's called Move to Amend. It is a national movement in this country that is actually calling for a constitutional amendment to make it clear that corporations are not persons, that they do not have constitutional rights. And guess how many times corporate media has covered us at Move to Amend? I'll give you a hint. 0. And in fact, in the month of June last year, 25,000 of us converged on Atlanta, where we participated in the U.S. Social Forum. I know Leah was there, a couple of others. Anybody else in Atlanta for the U.S. Social Forum?
In Detroit, David.
Oh, the first one was in Atlanta. Last year was in Detroit. How many of you were in Detroit? Leah, yeah? About 25,000. How many times did we get covered in the corporate media nationally? Not a single time. Here's something interesting. 3 weeks prior, the Tea Party had its convention. 600 people showed up. It was on every single television program, news program, for weeks before and after. Every print journal covered it, everything, right? The Koch brothers have spent probably $1 million at the Tea Party.
Liberal press.
That's right. And I like to point out the press in this country is just as liberal as the multi-billionaires who own it. So here's the thing. At Move to Amend, we now have over 103,000 people who are calling for a constitutional amendment. So I'm going to invite you. I know many of you have probably already signed this at movetoamend.org, but if you haven't, I'm going to ask you to please sign up. And if you have signed it, or if you just think, Cobb, you're crazy, it'll never work, pass it along. But if you would like to, all I'll ask, ma'am, print legibly. As an organizer, there's nothing more difficult. So here, I'm going to stop now. I'm going to thank the Veterans for Peace. I'm going to thank the Pacific Green Party and thank all of you for coming out. So thank you.